Ever since the divorce, a process that felt less like a legal separation and more like a violent sanding down of his former life, Elaine found himself systematically avoiding mirrors. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, more like a logistical consequence of Sylvia's efficiency. Save for the necessary fixtures in the bathrooms, his once warmly decorated house had become aggressively barren of reflective surfaces. Sylvia had taken everything of visual substance, the heavy, antique-framed cheval mirror that had stood sentinel in the bedroom corner, quietly witnessing the dissolution of a marriage that, in retrospect, seemed doomed from its very beginning. She took the large decorative mirror from the foyer and even the small silver-backed compact he'd once seen her use to check her lipstick before a dinner party. Once those major visual anchors had followed Sylvia to her new brightly lit bungalow across town, Elaine's reflection could typically only be found above the sink while he performed the basic rituals of hygiene, brushing his teeth, washing his hands. But even this minimal exposure was easily curtailed. He simply learned to occupy his attention elsewhere, focusing on the perfect placement of the toothpaste on the bristles or counting the rotations of the faucet handle. He trained his sight to stick to the chipped porcelain of the sink basin. If he were honest, the time he was most likely to see his own image was in the black, sheer screen of his phone after it had finally died and powered off, the battery neglected, after hours of mindless, shallow scrolling while he sank into the worn leather of his Chesterfield sofa. And even then, the sudden, intrusive appearance of his own face served as a sharp, unwelcome cue. Elaine would instantly shift his sight elsewhere, typically taking this moment as the definite sign to abandon the couch and drag himself to bed for the evening, leaving the dark glass to reflect the empty room instead. But as the months dragged on, pulling the debris of his former life further out to sea, Elaine's avoidance transitioned from passive circumstance to active campaign. It evolved from simply lacking reflective surfaces to strategically navigating the few that remained. The reason was brutally simple. Every insecurity he harbored about his own body, his fundamental sense of self, seemed all the more pronounced, magnified, and grotesque in the harsh, unforgiving clarity of glass. These flaws were now the only features he could focus on, an endless loop of self-criticism. He scrutinized his hairline, which was retreating faster than his former in-laws after the settlement. He worried about his degrading posture, a permanent slump that spoke volumes about his current emotional state. The perpetual dark, crescent moons under his eyes were now so deep they looked less like fatigue and more like poorly applied permanent makeup. The weight he'd put on felt less like padding and more like a heavy, visible armor against the world. He knew intellectually that he was playing up these negative qualities, that the way he saw himself was a cruel, distorted portrayal compared to how the rest of the world likely saw him. He was aware that this self-loathing was a symptom of the emotional fallout, not an objective truth. Yet this rational understanding did little to stump the fixation. He zeroed in on the enlarged pores across his nose and cheeks, the grained, sallow complexion of his skin that spoke of processed food and too much cheap wine, and the tired creases radiating from the corners of his mouth. After a while, his reflection ceased being a simple image. It became an unwelcome, judgmental guest in the house, a harbinger of all his failures, one that he fled from at all costs, preferring the vague, comforting anonymity of darkness to the confrontation of the light. He now moved through his house like a ghost, lest he accidentally conjure his own. Looking back, Elaine couldn't remember the first day it happened. He worked from home, balancing Excel files for people he never and will never meet face to face, and the days had begun to blend even before Sylvia and his split. He had been pacing outside his office, an activity he had once claimed helped him focus and brainstorm, but now seemed more aimless. His bathroom door across the hall was open, the sink directly across from him as he marched. His gaze remained on his feet and the floor in front of him, nothing in his peripheral other than the bathroom whenever he turns to pace in the opposite direction. And it was in that peripheral that he caught a glimpse of something. The mirror above the sink took up the entire alcove of the wall, a flat, slightly smudged rectangle of glass. The undefined silhouette of his figure was unmistakable in the corner of his eye, matching his shuffling up and down the hallway. But on the edge of his vision, he spotted something new, a shadow in the reflection that he had never noticed in his years of pacing. He halted his march and looked at the mirror, but was met only with the dour look of a man counting down the hours, no shadow where he could have sworn his peripheral had sensed. He knew he was tired, well, maybe not tired, exhausted may be the better word. He was sleeping more than he had ever done in his life, really, and even when he was up and working, his day never took him beyond his office chair, couch, or hall where he paced. But despite the lack of physical exertion in his day, he was never able to shake the feeling of being spent, both physically and emotionally. For these reasons, the shadow in his mirror was easy to brush away, even after it persisted for weeks, a consistent smudge out of the corner of his eye that vanished whenever he tried to fixate on the reflection. It was only after a particularly troubling day at work, filled with unanswered emails and technical hiccups, that he noticed a change in the mirror. The shadow that had once vanished from view whenever he focused on it remained, even after he looked up to focus on the reflection. And it was that Tuesday, at 2:43 p.m., that Elaine first laid eyes on the glad man in the mirror. The man stood in the space the shadow once occupied, right on the border of the mirror's glass, partially out of frame. His figure reached the top of the mirror, towering over Elaine's reflection. He had a baggy coat that reached past the bottom of the mirror, water dripping down the material as if he'd just come in from the rain. He was lit harshly, a bright light accentuating the shadows and creases on his clothes and face, as if illuminated by a bright flash that did not affect anything else in the room. And on the half of his face that was visible, a broad smile sat painted, almost mockingly gleeful. As Elaine stared unmoving at this glad man in the mirror, the man gazed back with bright, orange-tinted eyes. Elaine waited for his adrenaline to kick in, for the lurch from deep in his chest to activate, firing every neuron in his body with a single, focused command: run. But instead, Elaine felt fixated. The man stood unmoving, just half his body visible in the mirror, as if he was standing off-center of the sink, staring forward. But of course, there was no one else in the house, just Elaine, his reflection, and the glad-looking man. Elaine studied the man's face, frozen and unblinking. Despite the cruel look on his too wide smile, there was a familiarity to his face that Elaine couldn't shake, as if the man's cruel smile had knowledge about something within Elaine that he was keeping to himself, a secret shared by only the two men. And then Elaine blinked, and the man was gone. Elaine's wide-eyed reflection, the sole figure remaining in the mirror. This ritual continued for weeks. Sometimes the glad man would appear just for a moment in the reflection. Sometimes he would disappear for days. Other times he would be center of the reflection, looming behind Elaine, who could swear he could almost feel breath on his neck. After a while, it wasn't only the bathroom mirror where Elaine could find the man. Any reflection in the house where Elaine might catch his own image was joined by the towering, smiling man. But that panic that Elaine had expected never did arrive. Instead, the glad man brought out a sense of morbid curiosity within Elaine. Whenever he appeared, Elaine found himself locked into a staring contest with a figure who never blinked, never moved a muscle, only watched, his wide smile dotted by two ridiculing orange eyes. And that twinging sense of familiarity never left either. Elaine would stare at the glad man in the mirror, trying to grasp where he had seen the figure, his face warped in just such a way to remove any relation to a recognizable face. The expression on the man's face never changed, a deriding sense of superiority, like the man's happiness was at the expense of Elaine's, and he was proud of this fact. Even when Elaine wasn't looking in the mirror, he still found his thoughts drawn back to the glad man. He would sit at his computer in his empty-feeling home, the exhaustion of years of a dying marriage that culminated in an emotionally draining divorce weighing on him like a thick cloud, each breath he took drawing more of it into his lungs. And he would think of the man in the mirror, knowing he was there without having to look. What did he have to be so happy about? Over time, every moment of melancholy Elaine found himself slumping into felt like a personal victory for the glad man, like he was giving the man in the mirror exactly what he wanted. But after a few months of consistent visits by the glad man, a strange feeling began to bubble. Elaine never considered himself a petty man, nor someone who was ruled by his emotions. But whenever he found himself giving in to the exhaustion, allowing him the time to wallow in his situation, a new emotion began to rise to the surface. Contempt. The man in the mirror was enjoying this dance, Elaine indulging in self-pity while the glad man stood triumphant and ecstatic, and a spark began to burn in Elaine's stomach. Therapy, meds, mindful exercises, had tried all of these to attempt to reignite some of the fire he once had in him, with no success. But now, with this giant, mocking man grinning at him every time he looked in the mirror, Elaine wasn't sure if he could consider this feeling motivation, but it was enough to ignite the smallest of changes. And so, Elaine started to take action. Slowly at first, finding moments where he would allow himself to slink into his couch for hours and instead leaping up to his feet. Just standing at first, not accomplishing anything, sometimes for almost half an hour, but it still felt like a small victory. A tiny win against the glad man in the mirror. Before long, Elaine found himself going outside again. No major exercise, just walks. Anything to stop him from slumping down and having the day wash past him. Movement became his go-to weapon against the glad man. While he wouldn't say his mood was improving, that petty contempt he felt in the pit of his stomach for the man in the mirror kept him active, kept him productive when every part of his body was telling him to lie down for hours. And that could be considered progress, right? The man in the mirror remained present throughout the weeks, his smile wide despite his wet clothes, but Elaine didn't care. He even found himself flipping off the mirror more often than not. And the times when Elaine found himself staring at the man, his glowing orange eyes locking Elaine in a trance, he would snap himself out and hurry to clean a portion of the house. Elaine wasn't even striving for happiness anymore. If he was going to improve his life entirely out of spite, so be it. No one ever said self-improvement needed to come from a place of hopefulness. If he needed to live the rest of his life fueled by energetic bursts of scorn, then so be it. And it was during one of these motivated rushes of energy, an energetic sweep of the kitchen to stave off a 2 o'clock nap, that he noticed the photograph under the fridge. Its edge poked out right below the bottom of the appliance, knocked loose by the broom as Elaine cleaned. He looked down at the visible corner of the photo, recognizing it as one that used to hang on the front of the fridge. The sheet must have been knocked loose while Sylvia was moving out, drifting under the fridge and out of sight. Elaine swept at the photo an additional time to free it, bending down for a closer look. He couldn't recall the exact occasion the photo displayed, no matter how hard he stared at the glossy square magnetically affixed to his stainless steel refrigerator. Was it a birthday? A promotion? Maybe it was a night of unbridled celebration, or perhaps just an ordinary Tuesday night with friends. No monumental reason needed other than to enjoy each other's easy, warm company. What was displayed was a knot of laughing people, Sylvia included, all posed tightly together in front of a glowing neon sign that bathed them from behind in a fluorescent pink aura. The only detail Elaine could distinctly recall from that particular night was the rain, a torrential, cleansing downpour, and how much the entire group seemed to enjoy themselves despite the weather, not because of it. Because there, right in the center of the photo, Elaine stood. He was grinning from ear to ear, His entire face stretched into an expression of raw, genuine happiness. Water beaded and dripped from the shoulders of his leather jacket, and his eyes, caught perfectly by the photographer's flash, gleamed with a faint, almost orange hue, shining with an uncomplicated joy that felt utterly foreign to him now. What precisely did he have to be so happy about that night? Had life truly been that much better than it was now? Undoubtedly. He was in a radically different stage in life now. The messy, exhausting complications of adult life, divorce, financial instability, pervasive loneliness, had comprehensively replaced the youthful, unburdened optimism that the Elaine in the photograph displayed. That Elaine had hopes that hadn't been systematically demolished yet. But in spite of everything the past miserable year had thrown at him, the betrayals, the silence, the sheer exhaustion, deep down, that young Elaine was still buried in him somewhere, a fossil beneath the sediment of despair. He knew he was starting from a different kind of zero now, a deeper, emptier starting point, but the fundamental possibility of returning to that joyful optimism hadn't yet been fully extinguished. It was just dormant. Despite the upsets, the agonizingly rocky times, and what felt like an entire year wasted in a numbing miasma of grief, the Elaine standing in the empty kitchen was still, irrevocably, the same Elaine as the man captured in the photo. That smiling, glad, slightly wet Elaine. Elaine slowly shifted his gaze from the faded photo to the front of the refrigerator itself. The surface, being aluminum steel, acted as a wide, slightly convex mirror. For the first time in months, he didn't immediately flinch or look away. There was only one figure in the reflection now, a man a decade older, heavier, certainly grayer, surrounded by the stark, quiet lines of a solitary existence. He looked at the bags under his own eyes, the tired posture, the features he usually cataloged as flaws, but this time he didn't fixate. He looked at the whole man, the one who had survived. And as he looked, right there on the reflective metal, he saw the faint beginnings of a new, glad expression starting to grow across his face. It wasn't the exuberant, wide grin of the photo, but a small, determined upturn of the corners of his mouth, a private smile for the man who was still here. It was a faint, almost shy flicker of acknowledgement, a silent promise from the present Elaine to the past Elaine. I'm still in the fight. He reached out and gently tapped the surface of the refrigerator, a silent, non-verbal handshake with the reflection that he hadn't avoided for the first time in a very long time. He might be on his own, the house too quiet, the future uncertain, but the light, however dim, was back on.